Welcome everyone, ברוכים הבאים, ברוכים הבאות. האורח שלנו גם יודע עברית, אבל ההרצאה תוכל להיות באנגלית. אני רואה שאתה בעברית גם. קצת. This is a special seminar of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration and also sponsored by the EU Studies Program at Aviv University and the Hartog School of Government. Very happy that you have all arrived today. We have our friend of old days and colleague, Professor Stephan Stetter from the Bundeswehr University in Munich, Professor of International Politics and Conflict Studies, also currently visiting at the Bologna University for this year. I will soon let you speak. I just want to welcome all of you to the association and its activities and encourage you to participate. I'm taking this opportunity to let you know that we'll have an annual meeting as every year in December. You'll be receiving the call for papers over the summer, and this has been a nice event in recent years for about 20 or even 30 speakers. Hopefully this will be this time happening in Jerusalem, but for this it will be talk over dinner. So I'm Tal Sader. I'm the head of this association, and with me is Professor Alfred Tuvias, my mentor, my supervisor, and longtime inspiration, founder of the association. And Alfred, would you like to say some few words?
I am always happy to see around this table and other similar tables at the Hebrew University, Bar Ilan, etc. All those who are interested in modern Europe, in the European Union and its relations with our small country. And I will be eager to hear my old friend, really old friend and student of at the time in 1996 at the Rothberg International School. So many years I know him, and he's a wonderful person. And I let Tal introduce him. Thank you all for coming. I am very happy.
Hey, Stephan, let's get to it.
Thank you, תודה, אלפרד. שלום, עמיתים וחברים יקרים. לפני שאעבור עוד רגע לאנגלית, אני רוצה לומר שני דברים בעברית. ראשית, תודה רבה על ההזמנה להרצאה הזו. אני שמח מאוד לחזור לארץ אחרי 5 שנים ולפגוש את כולכם כאן. ראשית, ללא תרגול יומיומי של דיבור עברית, זה קשה מאוד, אם אתה לא מדבר עברית כל יום. הרצאה בעברית למרבה הצער אינה אפשרית. אולי זה יתאפשר לאחר שהגיע למעמד אמריטוס, כמו גם המנטור שלי אלפרד. אני עדיין לא שם, אז אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. Thank you. That's the trouble with languages. You have to really engage with them on a daily basis. Catch up with that. So you invite me again in 15 or 16 years down the line, and then I promise, or I hope I can promise that it will be delivered in. My talk is entitled Middle East Regional Politics, Global Order, and the Role of Europe. I wish to thank Tel Aviv University, you, Tal and Alfred personally, and the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration for inviting me. It is taking the first sip, maybe a somewhat awkward cocktail that gets mixed when putting in one shaker 3 issues, namely Middle East politics, global order, and the role of Europe. But since I thought it is afternoon, I tried preparing this sundowner for us. All these 3 topics are tasteful ingredients to any student of international relations. And I think these are also issues that are connected with each other and matter in the political world out there. Global order, what Europe is doing or not doing, and what is happening in the Middle East. It is a common theme in area studies and in IR to discuss the relationship between the Middle East regional level and the global level. I think it's fair to say that there's heavy traffic in both directions, regional, global, global, regional. For example, and people like Fred Halliday and others have looked at that, during the Cold War, scholars studied how the two superpowers of the day, the US and the USSR, fostered alliances in the region, engaged in peacemaking and muddled in domestic affairs from Iran to Egypt. On the other hand, area scholars have compellingly shown that regional leaders excelled in using these superpowers for their own domestic and regional agendas. King Hussein of Jordan or Sadat of Egypt being historical examples. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Benjamin Netanyahu, or Mohammed bin Salman more recently. Moreover, on a broader societal level, the interest of external actors in the Middle East underlines this global interest in and engagement with the Middle East. Think of individuals and organizations who have become stakeholders of important narratives about what the Middle East is. From Mark Twain's reports in the 1860s about his journey to the then Ottoman Holy Land, from Gertrude Bell in the 1920s, to UN peacekeepers on the Sinai, to NGOs, amongst them German political foundations. I thought there will be somebody here from a German political foundation with whom I personally have worked on a couple of projects in different Middle East countries. And again, like a mirror image, intellectuals, political groups, think tanks, and other stakeholders from throughout the Middle East are versed in interacting with societies and political arenas beyond the region. Finally, the many conflicts, frozen and active in the Middle East, all have a global dimension. They impact security and identities elsewhere. Global connections on a material or an immaterial basis ensure a constant flow both ways of political ideas and ideologies, alliances of people, capital, weapons, and aid from the outside into the region, and of course, inside out. And it is this global regional interplay, rather than either of the two, which fundamentally shapes the way politics and conflicts in the Middle East evolve. So if you buy into this, what I've just said, and I think there's some good reason to do so, then we can cross-tick the two dimensions of global order and regional politics of my talk. It makes sense to discuss them both in tandem. Does it make sense to add a third ingredient to our cocktail, namely the role of Europe? I would strongly suggest that it does indeed make sense, and would like to use the remainder of my talk today to substantiate this claim by discussing this triangular relationship. Europe matters to the Middle East and global affairs, and vice versa. What happens in the Middle East and regional arenas elsewhere, of course, is of relevance and affects the interests of Europe. It would be interesting to take a historical angle, of course, since the patterns of security and insecurity throughout the world and also in the Middle East have a strong historical European imprint relating to the gradual encroachment of European powers into the Ottoman Empire and other parts of the MENA region since Napoleon landed in Egypt 1798 and in nearby Jaffa, nearby from here, a year later in 1799. Time management does not allow me to take this time-related perspective. When I speak of Europe today, I will relate mainly to the European Union. This should not let us ignore other elements of what also constitutes contemporary Europe, politically speaking. Thus, what matters are individual EU member states, from big ones like France and Germany, to Italy and Poland, to small ones that are nevertheless powerful precisely because they are part of the EU umbrella, like Luxembourg, Estonia, or Ireland. And it includes the European pillar of NATO. I think it's very essential, not least because discussions about the strengthening of the European NATO pillar are of great relevance today, given the doubts about how much Europeans can rely on and trust the United States within NATO, politically, when it comes to Article 5, but also with regard to strategic enablers and the nuclear umbrella as far as the military dimension of NATO is. taking a European perspective finally means to have in mind key European states outside the EU, bigger ones like the UK or Ukraine, or also Turkey. Turkey and the UK are at least regional powers, the latter with the nuclear arsenal, the United Kingdom, while Ukraine has, thanks to Russia's war, today the biggest and most experienced army on the continent, whose strength does play a great role in current security strategies pondered on in Brussels, both in the EU and the NATO context. But in particular, when it comes to issues like diplomacy, mediation and aid, one should also have in mind smaller European states like Norway or Switzerland who capitalize on their niche powers in world politics on exactly these dimensions. I will present my thoughts about this triangular relationship between the global level, the Middle East, and Europe in 3 steps, starting with the changing security architecture in Europe. That will be the first thing I look at. Doing so, I will look at recent developments in EU foreign and security politics. I consider it important to understand that both in the EU and in the NATO context, and also in the wider European security landscape, significant changes are currently unfolding that relate to the threat posed by Russia, the insecurity about where the United States stands in relation to democracy, key alliances, and international law, and in relation to a changing international system in which states from the so-called global south, so-called because it's not a homogeneous group, have and will become more central to the global order and to regional security architecture. At the EU and NATO level, European states are reacting to these external triggers, and one can safely say that one of the most dynamic fields of European integration in the last 10 years has been in the area of foreign and in particular security policy. Having this update on where Europe stands in mind, I will then, secondly, address the current political landscape in the Middle East, and I will focus on what I think are key dynamics shaping regional politics, security, and conflict, and discuss how this relates to Europe. I will highlight here what I think is a considerable security interrelationship between Europe and the Middle East, shaped by history and geographical proximity. Thirdly, and this is a very short conclusion then, I will finish my talk with a couple of observations on the global level, because both what Europe is doing and what states and non-state actors in the Middle East are doing is in turn fundamentally shaped by global development. Looking at conflicts and occasionally also peacemaking, I focus here in particular on the geopolitical and the societal level. I suggest that the Middle East, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, is a key regional arena shaping global developments. Conflicts from Yemen, Syria to Israel and Palestine affect global security, as do stability-oriented initiatives such as the Abraham Accords or the ambitious modernization agenda in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and elsewhere. As a caveat, I should say that I don't present today an academic article, one in which I would elaborate on a very narrow research argument. Instead, and for the purpose of today's seminar, I decided to rather present to you insights that draw from a somewhat broader perspective based on research, second-track diplomacy, travels, and policy advice I have done in various contexts, such as with Robbie Nathanson, who is here in Israel. Hoping that this is also fruitful for our discussion today in Naftali Hall, Venezuela Hall, and maybe over a drink or a cocktail afterwards. So let me start with what is happening in Europe's security. Following my roadmap, I now want to update us on recent developments within this policy field of foreign and security policy. This is very important because the last years, starting with the European Commission headed by Jean-Claude Juncker since 2014, have seen substantial changes in the way EU foreign policies look like. I'm well aware that within the context of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, that right, and other study programs, the EU study program, most of you are well aware of what is going on in the EU, but I hope to give my elaborations maybe a spin that is informative to those not looking into the Brussels machinery every day, and maybe thought-provoking for those here who are expert on this topic. The following aspects should be emphasized. First, Europe has substantially invested in what is sometimes called hard security. Defense and security are today central elements of EU policy. This growing focus on hard security relates to political strategy, financial underpinnings, and military infrastructure. It is firstly visible in key policy documents. From the Mogherini security strategy of 2016, she was the High Representative for the EU foreign policy at the time, to Josep Borrell's strategic compass of 2022, he was her successor, and extends to the recent white paper for European Defense Readiness 2030 of the von der Leyen Commission, who started her office as Commission President by pleading for a geopolitical commission, as she termed it. Secondly, alongside this policy document level, it is visible in the structural integration of defense into the Brussels policy machine, in particular the EU military staff in the European Union's External Action Service, and in financial and organizational reinforcement visible in the immense financial plan for defense-related loans and grants in the white paper, on the moves to joint procurement and armed forces, the move towards joint procurement and integration of armies and armed forces, and defense industry integration in Europe in various projects from the European Defense Agency to PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. This is all linked to the mutual assistance clause under Article 42 of the EU Treaty, which foresees that in an event of military threat, member states are meant to support each other by all means possible, a bit like the light NATO Article 5 copy in the EU Treaty. In a nutshell, the EU still has many components of what Duchenne called in the 1970s civilian power, but uniforms and badges and talk about land, air, sea, space, and cyber capabilities are today part and parcel of EU policy making in Brussels. Having said this, it has to be understood that this transformation of the EU is, and that is well known to students of the multi-level EU machine, is incremental and fuzzy. The EU is, and I think will remain, a supranational polity based on its own actorhood on the one hand, but also constant internal negotiations, vetoes, and strive for often cumbersome consensus making, with a preference for piecemeal projects that come bottom up rather than strategic policy by design. So the EU doesn't have a joint army. There is no European army, although this is sometimes in the headlines of debates, but many things are happening in the defense strategy and military field. This is what I wanted to say. It is crucial now here to understand that the need for consensus has dramatically increased within Europe, since it has become clear that Europe and the EU as such are threatened by Russia's revisionist policy in general and the war in Ukraine in specific. Historians might one day conclude that Ukraine's wish to deeply entangle with the European Union through an association agreement not only triggered the Maidan protest of 2014, but also underlies much of the geopolitical tensions that, in combination or in linkage with the revisionist Russian worldview on world affairs that can be, for example, read in Putin's policy statement or article that he has written shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine on a historical unity of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, an interesting document to read, and that all this shapes the European security parameter. Be that as it may, there's broad but not unanimous consensus in the EU and amongst European NATO members about the threats posed by Russia, both conventionally and hybrid. This is well elaborated in the strategic compass of the European Union and in the defense white paper, but also in NATO's defense planning process, which is the ongoing process of redesigning NATO defense strategy. This securitization of EU and NATO Europe, which then includes also Norway, Iceland, the UK, Turkey, and others, is nurtured by insecurities about where the US stands on all this. Within the EU, and I would say also in NATO, the old distinction between transatlantic and continental orientations, dating back to the days of de Gaulle, have lost some relevance, not all, but some. Both European strategic autonomy and independence, European strategic autonomy and European independence, as Emmanuel Macron has termed it, are no longer a French extravaganza, but a serious consideration being pondered upon also in Warsaw, in The Hague, in Berlin, and Copenhagen, traditional transatlantic oriented powers. It is also relevant at the NATO level, where steps towards a more capable European pillar of NATO are actively pursued, both in terms of operational capacities, the financing of defense in Europe, and chains of command. All this deeply affects the national level too, with Sweden and Finland having joined NATO after centuries of alliance independence. I think in Sweden it dates back to the Russian-Swedish wars that they were an independent nation standing outside of alliance. As a footnote for the connoisseurs of European politics, Denmark has withdrawn its opt-out from the EU common defense policy after Russia invaded Ukraine. In some, all member states increased their defense budgets and defense readiness. Again, US expectations to do so are one reason, and overall threat assessments related to Russia being another driver. From a military perspective, Turkey and the UK as NATO members with significant armed forces that have, as Turkey has, considerable geopolitical outreach, Europe, Middle East, or as the UK, nuclear capabilities and a veto in the UN Security Council are central in this NATO discussion. The same applies, as I've already said, to Ukraine, whose armed forces are a key asset in all EU-wide security discussions, and the porcupine strategy, if this is currently called, pursued by the EU and European states, meant to undermine Russia's neo-imperialism at the source. So the expectation, I think, is not that that Ukraine will necessarily win, but that is the porcupine that keeps Russia occupied in Ukraine. This is not to say that there's unity. European politics navigate since centuries, maybe historians would say, between integrationist and centrifugal dynamics. But I would suggest that as far as the EU is concerned, the recent years are a fundamental change that has left a huge imprint. Internally, with defense being arguably the most dynamic field of European integration in the last decade. And externally, in relation to the erosion of the Helsinki process on which European peace architecture rested and which was shattered by Russia, not only since its illegal war against Ukraine, dating from whenever you want to start it, 2014 with Crimea or 2022, but being visible in hindsight in relation to its war in Georgia in 2008, the illegal occupation of Georgian territory ever since, and its massive human rights violation in Chechnya and in Syria. The centrifugal forces should be mentioned, though, as well. These are in particular of a domestic nature and relate, in Europe and elsewhere, to the rise of neo-nationalist, populist, and illiberal movements. It is not a European affair, as developments in democracies such as Argentina, the US, Britain, Israel, or India show. It is not entirely domestic, of course, since there's a mutual reinforcement between these political movements, lastly visible in the election of a new Polish president. There's a transnational component to this political movement, and strengthening these forces through hybrid wars is part of Russia's policy agenda in the information space. Weakening the rule of law, the separation of powers, and instrumentalizing minority rights is the most visible element of this populist international. As a caveat, though, I think this is important, liberal and progressive movements should also think of other factors that have weakened their status amongst voters and traditional constituencies, liberal parties from the center-right to the left have. And neither is this distinction neat. For example, at least until today, as I observe it in Italy, Italy's Giorgia Meloni has not aligned on the foreign policy file with Slovakia or with Hungary. But one should not focus only on the security dimension when discussing Europe's role. That would be a militarization of our thought about foreign policy. The EU is strongest where it acts with where its power lies, namely its role as the biggest trading power in the world. Global connections matter to Europe, and as, for example, the visit of Brazilian President Lula da Silva to France last week has shown, projects such as an EU-Mercosur agreement or other policies are part of the EU foreign policy strategy of the EU. All official documents of the EU attest to this centrality of creating global connections through trade. not only because of the economic benefit this might entail, but also because in today's world, reaching out to this diverse global south is important. This might then ultimately work better because the relationship is likely today to be more balanced, a contrast to the unequal economic relations with the ACP countries back in the 1960s, or in the context of European thought region building in the days of the Barcelona process of the 1990s, which was a joint endeavor, but probably Eurocentrically conceived, and approaches which I actually came to study here first in seminars taught by Alfred Grovias at the Hebrew University. From a perspective of global order, all this matters. It is a grave misjudgment, in my view, to think that the world can be carved up into three spheres of influence run by the US, Russia, and China. All these countries have considerable domestic problems and challenges to address. And they are not alone in the driver's seat when it comes to international affairs. Brazil, Canada, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, etc., hold considerable hard and soft power in international politics, and so does the European Union and individual EU member states. What I think can be observed, though, is hedging in current information. Not alienating the US too much, but being resilient enough in case this cannot be avoided. It is based on this strategic thinking that the EU strives for global partnerships and bases this on the premise that a multilateral order based on international law, treaty-based relations, and human rights is not a relic of the past, but the fundament of the international order on which European security ultimately rests as well. Again, this does not mean that Europe is united in how it sees its interests, such as when it comes, for example, to interests in the Middle East. While there is an overarching consensus on key foreign policy issues from Iran to Syria, some consensus to the war between Hamas and Israel, there are tensions between European states that are based on national traditions, geographic vulnerabilities, and ideological orientation of the government. Students of EU-Israel relations are well aware of this, and as Leo Herman has so well shown, this dates back to the negotiations on the preferential access to the common market in the 1950s and 60s with Israel, where the European community at the time already was divided in how to approach Israel. Such tensions have again resurfaced recently. It was only in February 2025, so very well into the changed situation since 7 October 2023 and the Gaza war, that the last meeting of the EU-Israel Association Council was held in February 2025. While 2 weeks ago, 17 of the 27 member states asked the European Commission, in the light of the conduct of war in Gaza, to provide a legal assessment of whether Israel violates the human rights stipulations of the 2000 association agreements on which this association council builds, and whether this agreement should on that basis be suspended. A report from the European External Action Service was then leaked to the press also a couple of days ago that has made some observers argue that the Commission might find it difficult not to suggest that the temporary suspension on legal grounds should take place. I'm not so sure about this, for the political reality in Brussels is different. While, in contrast to sanctions, they have to be decided by unanimity, and the US and the European Union has a lot of sanctions against various countries, Syria and others. They will now be lifted from the European Union as the Syria sanctions from the US will be lifted. A suspension of an agreement can be decided by majority vote. Germany and Italy are central for such a majority, and their consent appears, for me, unlikely at the moment, in my reading of the situation. As noted, this is not the first time in EU-Israel relations that there are strong tensions, but the current level arguably is somewhat unprecedented, not just at the government level, but also because in the aftermath of the Hamas attack of 7 October on Israel and the war in Gaza, these topics have become central topics at the societal level throughout Europe and in other parts of the world too. There are very strong opinions held on what is happening here. There's a very strong polarization that sees pro-Palestine, pro-Israel groups competing in the public space, often with very one-sided arguments, while anti-Semitism is on the rise. So this has, I think, changed the security situation. It's not just political, it's deeply societal as well, not only to be sure. Now, how does the regional security architecture in the Middle East relate to Europe against the background of these developments? What is going on in Europe? This is the core question I want to address. The first thing to note, not a cocktail, but water. The first thing to note is that there is a re-regionalization of security patterns akin to what Barry Buzan and Oliveira have termed regional security complexes. One can rightfully ask how much the Middle East matters to Europe at a time when Europe's main focus in foreign policy is oriented towards the manifold threats posed by Russia in Ukraine and beyond. A lot of what is going on in Europe, the main focus and concern is Ukraine. There are other reasons, geography and history being central here, in other words, spatial and temporal entanglements, why the Middle East is such important to Europe, and I would also argue vice versa. Proximity matters here. Europe and the Middle East are neighbors with land and sea borders from Turkey to the Mediterranean, while insecurity in the region is at times directly linked to the European security architecture. Think of how Russia built up its military posture deployed in Ukraine, inter alia in Syria, but also of other security challenges that have to do with political instability and poverty, with migration movements, as well as with political radicalization and terrorism, both in Europe and beyond, for example, in the Red Sea region. Sven Biskop, one of the leading observers of EU security policy, makes the reasonable argument here that while the European pillar of NATO is and will be primarily linked to the resilience of the security architecture in Europe vis-à-vis Russia, the EU and its national military and civilian structures in foreign policy have a main role to play in relation to the southern neighborhood, and crisis response is needed in that context. While we are no longer, and hopefully we come back to that maybe one day on equal terms on both sides of the Mediterranean, in the days of the Euro-Mediterranean region building in its comprehensive form, this was the Barcelona process, or the more utilitarian approach of the European neighborhood policy, one should not base the relationship of the EU with the Middle East on such threat-based security perspectives alone. There's a lot of potential for cooperation, from traditional trade relations, green and classical energy, and from defense cooperation to joint diplomatic activities to foster political stability, limiting, for example, the threat of state failure from Libya, Yemen, and Sudan to Syria and Lebanon. The relationships on this level are also not one-sided. For Middle Eastern states such as Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and others have a lot to offer too, creating, in fact, interdependencies that underlie much of the realpolitik strive of EU-Middle East relations. Another reason why I think that the EU will be very hesitant moving ahead with questioning the association agreement, because there are interdependencies that also affect Europe in my analysis. Having this entanglement between the Middle East and Europe and recent security challenges in mind, two dates are standing out. 7 October 2023, with the Hamas attack on Israel and the ensuing war in Gaza, and 8 December 2024, when Assad was toppled in Syria. From a general perspective, the Middle East is central to European security, as the Syrian civil war has shown. Insecurities in the region have spillover effects. The wars in Syria and before in Iraq and even in faraway Afghanistan have led to migration challenges that have deeply shaken European society and party systems. Rise of right-wing parties. The aftermath of 7 October undergirds the polarization in European society, a rise in anti-Semitism, and a concern about the livelihood of people in Gaza. Since migration has reached its peak in 2015, Turkey has re-emerged as a key player with the migration pact with the European Union that reflects Turkey's growing geopolitical standing, also epitomized by mediation Turkey is doing between Russia and Ukraine, but also in relation to Turkey's role in Syria and its role in the Southern Caucasus. The EU and the Gulf states, this widens the circle. As a core emerging powerhouse, the Gulf states, as attested not only by Trump's recent visit, but also by the fact that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are hosting World Cups in football within a time span of only 12 years. You have visited the World Cup in Qatar. I plan to visit the World Cup in Saudi Arabia in 2034.
We'll go together.
Yeah. So against this background, the Gulf states are, of course, of increasing importance, as we all know, and both sides, the Gulf states and the EU, have responded to that, having held in 2024 the first official EU Gulf Cooperation Council summit. As outlined in the EU Global Strategy of 2016, the key interest of the EU in the region in the Middle East is state and societal stability, somewhat departing from the more normative region-building approach held previously. But normative considerations continue to be important. The EU strongly condemned, and I think one can say was shocked by 7 October 2020. This has led to an initially strong support of Israel. But as amongst liberal voices here in Israel, criticism of how the war in Gaza is conducted has become more relevant, based on two key concerns, namely about violations of international humanitarian law, and secondly, about the lacking political horizon offered by the current government in Israel that sees itself pitted in other domestic conflicts too, the so-called judicial reform, corruption trials of the prime minister, Haredi army service, or the ideological sway of Kahanists in the government. 7 October was not only perceived as a shock in Europe due to the brutality and ideological extremism with which Hamas operated and also justified what it has done. Hamas published a document after 7 October to the international public in which they explained on 20 pages in English what underlies this attack. And inflicting, as we all know, on the Jewish people, the greatest death toll at a day since the Shoah. Having my expressions fresh in mind from having been booked into the cinema hotel at Dizengoff Square, where the fountain there has turned into a memorial, it's very fresh in mind. One should also not forget that 7 October still takes a very heavy personal toll on Israelis. The fate of the hostages is an overriding concern. Geostrategically, the strike capacities of the Houthis have only recently been demonstrated. Sirens are an almost daily experience, and Israel has witnessed the uprooting of communities close to the Gaza Strip and in Israel's north. There are big concerns, security concerns in my view at the domestic. Europe had, maybe not always noted, strategic concerns here too, and this was the blow 7 October meant to Israel's deterrence capacities, which I would argue are and remain a European interest. Initially, deterrence of Israel has taken a blow in the month-long multi-front war with Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. Israel has succeeded in neutralizing Hezbollah for the time being, while the toppling of Assad and the regionally and internationally coordinated responses to Iran's two missile attacks on Israel has partly restored deterrence. This is welcome news, I would say, to Europe and also to many regional states, those currently having Abraham Accords with Israel and those who do not, like Saudi Arabia, but who were part of the informal liquid alliance, that's a quote, that's a term used by Rafaela del Sarto and Eduard Soler-Ilecha, that formed as a response by Israel, the US, Arab, and some European states to militarily respond to Iran's two attacks, the liquid alliance that Sartre and Soler calls. Next to these strategic concerns, political ones matter as well and exhibit a divergence between Europe and Israel. This is based on the assessment that the consecutive Netanyahu governments since 2009 have tried to avoid offering a political horizon for a meaningful peace process with the Palestinians, which does not mean in turn that the Palestinians have tried to pursue one. The PA is too weak and also domestically contested, and on a societal level, movements like BDS might have strengthened internal cohesion in pro-Palestinian movements, but have not contributed to an acceptable political horizon either. Through enabling support by Qatar, Netanyahu has ultimately strengthened Hamas rule over Gaza before 2023, with the occasional Gaza wars until 2023 operating to the famous lawn mowing strategy that ultimately fitted into the strategy to avoid offering a political horizon. I think it is fair to say that the criticism of Europe towards the way the current Gaza war is led is not about defeating Hamas, but about refraining to offer such a political horizon that includes those Palestinians in the PA and beyond willing to engage with Israel. Not least also because of the last 3 decades, the EU has heavily invested in relations to both sides, as Robbie has argued in a recent paper, economically as in the association agreement with Israel, and its huge financial contribution to the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian society. Having said this, the skepticism of Europe is shared by Arab countries who have signed to the Egyptian and Arab League Reconstruction and Development Plan for Gaza, which was hastily written in order to counter Trump's bombastic Riviera plan. It also offers an alternative to the Gideon's Chariot operation. The point thus is that I would like to make is that Europeans, and I would argue many Arab countries, even if they do not say this publicly, neither Arab countries nor Europe, do not oppose fighting Hamas within the militarily challenging urban environment of Gaza. What they do oppose and are skeptical of are 2 things. Firstly, human rights violations, including their legal and societal repercussions. Secondly, then the lack of political initiatives that establish security architectures in the Middle East that project stability within the region and beyond. From the EU's perspective, and a perspective I would share, this requires overall stability, a lasting and mutually agreed solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 8 December 2024, the toppling of Assad has turned the regional security situation even more dynamic. From a geopolitical perspective, Turkey has gained from this, while Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have, in that context, and as visible in Trump's recent visit, firmly put themselves on the map too. Israel has restored much of its deterrence and dealt on its own and with the liquid alliance I referred to a blow to the self-proclaimed axis of resistance, but is hampered by domestic developments and concerns in the region and beyond that, for example, render the conclusion of an Abraham Accord agreement with Saudi Arabia more unlikely. Israel and Jewish and non-Jewish voices from outside Israel are right in highlighting that there often is hypocrisy, outright anti-Semitism, and an obsession with Israel when it comes to Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not just a line from a right-wing playbook to refer to this hypocrisy. The threats to Israel from a national security perspective, but also to Jews worldwide, is real and makes policymaking on a regional security issue like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not only a challenge to both societies, in which powerful domestic players fervently oppose a mutually accepted peace, but also to international players such as the EU, which believe in and have an interest in Israel's right to exist and in Israeli security and self-defense, and in the right to self-determination of Palestinians as well. And ties European and Middle East security, which is not only visible in the aforementioned multilateral military responses to Iran missile attacks, but on a diplomatic level too, such as the summit co-sponsored by France and Saudi Arabia that will take place in New York end of June, and which is entitled Peaceful Settlement of the Palestinian Question and the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. I think this is a good example of how European and Middle East security structures interrelate, the joint French-Saudi summit. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I would like to conclude my presentation by making 3 short and pointed suggestions of why it is important to add the global dimension. I mentioned it already a bit when discussing Middle East and European security landscapes and their interconnection. First, security architectures and insecurity arenas cannot be understood without taking their global integration into account. This relates on a geopolitical level to the interconnectedness of key conflict theaters. That's how it is called in more geopolitical writing. from sub-Saharan Africa between the Sahel and the Red Sea to Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. At least these four arenas are strongly interconnected. For example, when it comes to Russia's role, the US influence and US bases in all these regions, the economic and strategic ambitions of China, but also as Tal Sadeh studied in relation to the interlinkages between globalization and wartime trade. The EU and other players in the Middle East and beyond are not bystanders here, but can actively shape these interconnections in a positive direction. One example here would be the envisaged India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that also underlines how an interest in stability and lasting conflict resolution is a prime interest of the EU, both in terms of minimizing classical threats and increasing its geopolitical posture and making economic gains. With a land corridor that would have to run from India, that's a sea corridor, through Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Israel, and maybe Lebanon and the future Palestinian state, to Europe, Greece, Italy, and France and other ports. This shows, secondly, that Europe, in the form of the EU, is a power that has global ambitions and also means to make itself relevant, contrary to sometimes prevalent swan songs that, paraphrasing Mark Twain here, prematurely announce the death of the EU in world politics, a claim that has been made for the last 4 decades. European capital, European diplomacy, and to some extent also European hard power is also actively demanded by actors around the globe, which, however, possess this capital too, be it in Riyadh, Ankara, Baku, Delhi, Jerusalem, or elsewhere. This underlies the importance not only of alliances, but of international law, more generally speaking, both in terms of treaties, such as in economic agreements or in stable alliances that are more than liquid alliances, and international humanitarian law. The centrality of international law is thus not only of importance in relation to the European security architecture. A rule-based international order is, I would argue, in the interest of Europe and other medium-sized powers with global outreach. Otherwise, you just leave it to Russia, China, the US. Finally, final point. Global political dynamics exert an immense impact on how patterns of security and insecurity, as well as conflict in the Middle East, play out. This can be seen on the geopolitical as well as on the society. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a case in point, not only since 2023, but for sure historically as well. Yet, the polarization which the ongoing conflict, the current situation, is producing on the societal scale in Europe, the US, and elsewhere is significant. It is not only a Kulturkampf that attests to the global ability of this conflict to become politicized, in contrast to some other conflicts, such as Congo or Sudan. This is also a big security problem, as, for example, in relation to rising anti-Semitic violence and narratives in Europe and the US. Recent attack in DC, for example, to staffers of the Israeli embassy, and threats to freedom of speech and academic freedom that we currently see in the United States. Forming liquid alliances that counter and fight such polarized and conflict-igniting trends while empowering interconnections based on political, human rights, security, and economic-related structures that minimize the spillover of insecurity is the challenge that results from it. I look forward to hearing your ideas and reflections about this, and would like to thank you now for your attention and for the invitation to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. But before making some of my own questions and opening the discussion to the floor, and Alfred also, I just remind people, members of the association, we are having an annual meeting after this seminar. So please don't rush out, stay for this part 2. So I think during part of the Europe Day events here, we had the ambassador from Poland and the vice ambassador from Germany. And I put to them some provocation, so I'd like to provoke you too. We talk about the place of Europe in the world, but I think the next step for Europe to really matter is actually inside. That is, once again, further integration. Now, one possible avenue for that is, and that's on the cards, that's on the table, is to integrate military industry ever more than before, rather than fragmented national industries. I mean, production can take place in various countries, but there has to be a single plan. It's not like the single market. I don't expect such a market to operate only under competition principles. Maybe more like the CAP, the agricultural policy, something that is coordinated and organized together. It's orchestrated, but it's a shared endeavor. So it's required operationally to have the platforms speak to each other and able to operate together, rather than always cater to an American standard, which is the current situation, really. And also create a sense that this is indeed a shared effort, security. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and that's, I think, also something that the European Union needs to do in response to populism, and these things that you mentioned are related, is to move forward in, once again, democratizing its decision-making process. My provocation is to, I understand that nobody wants to do a new treaty because that would mean referendums and you don't want to go there. Okay. But what you can do is to empower the president of the commission by the European Council turning itself into a college of electors, saying each prime minister that without any treaty change, that they will hold a referendum in their country and essentially run an advisory election campaign in each country for the presidency of the commission. And by law, they will then select the commissioner, the president of the commission, but would declare, or voluntarily, that they would obey a popular vote on the identity of it. I know that's a bit risky, because that's one of the things that keeps European leaders awake at night. But I think we all know there's a genuine, and you mentioned, I think, something in your, somewhere halfway through your talk, that there's a reason for everything, you know, and that there's some frustration by politics being a cartel of the same parties. I understand they like to keep this.
Yeah.
But if you really want to take the venom out of populism, I think this is, and it goes back to centralizing authority, to being a power, to be able to project power. Right now, everything is to, right, unanimity. Currently, Israel maybe hopes to enjoy unanimity, the requirement for unanimity to protect itself. But I think it was a German foreign minister who already said earlier, maybe a year ago, that it's time to do away with unanimity in security decisions. So that's treaty change, right? This is, you can't do this by. But I think something needs to push in that direction for the European Union to be an important power in world affairs. There's a potential. You need to do something in that direction.
I'll make a quick response. Yeah?
Or lengthy.
Yeah, or lengthy, no, it should not be lengthy. I completely agree with further integration. On defense policy, some of these steps are taken. There's the European Defense Agency, and there's huge money now to integrate and create a common defense market, which was always excluded from the common market. So I think changes are there, but for the time being, it's piecemeal. So I would see the connection with NATO as very important, because if this happens, this will happen because the Americans expect and the Europeans realize we should do it, because we don't know if we can count on the Americans to strengthen the European pillar of NATO. And everybody who's a defense specialist, I'm not a defense specialist, I'm working on military issues on a daily basis, but they say if you want to have the military structures in place, you need precisely. So if you want to have a European pillar of NATO, you have to have this European defense market. You have to have this defense integration, which does not amount into a European army, but of densely integrated units of an operational level, on a chain of command level. SACEUR, the supreme commander, should be European of NATO, etc. So definitely, so I would see this interrelationship with NATO very essential here. The danger is that it's piecemeal. So PESCO is permanent structured cooperation. This is the main defense military project program. It's a very European logic. It's money. It's based on a voluntary participation of EU member states and their armies in projects where they said, well, this is important to us. what they do with this is that they replace domestic funding of these defense planes because there's the European level. So that's convenient. This is nothing new, and there's also no overarching strategy of, I think it's currently 70 different projects: land, sea, air, cyber, strategic enablers, etc. So the overall strategy is missing, and for that you would need this political rejuvenation of the. I think, you know, I would completely agree. I think many things are not acceptable. I live in Italy now. I'm a European citizen, but when it comes to elections, I can only vote in municipal and European elections in Italy. Why can I vote for the Italian government? I hold the German citizenship. Why am I supposed to vote for the German parliament when I live in Italy? I live in a supranational polity, which is very much like a federation. This needs to change, and this is frustrating. And Europe is not really moving in these directions because everybody is afraid of treaty change. Some things you can do without treaty change, moving to qualified majority voting in foreign policy. Jean-Claude Juncker has suggested that is possible by the treaty. The council has to agree on that with unanimity again, but then you do have qualified majority voting, and Juncker said this should be on sanctions, human rights related issues, and civilian missions of it. It hasn't happened. It shows how difficult. Yes, the European Commission President, if I understood you correctly, it would be great if this person would be elected directly, Europol. This was done halfway because there's the Spitzenkandidaten, the leaders of the different political parties, but this has not really resulted in such a process. Simon Hicks has suggested that 2 decades ago, this direct. But the leaders are hesitant to put the European integration agenda on the agenda. This is a big mistake because the EU critical or anti-EU political forces in Europe, in almost all member states, they do exactly this, and the others are not doing this. And this follows a political strategy. I'm half Austrian as well. It's not better there, but I can tell you that in Germany, Chancellor Merkel for 16 years was a successful chancellor precisely because she avoided putting contested issues on the table. This was a political strategy. This is a big problem because in many member states, politicians do not dare putting these issues on the agenda because they fear that this is divisive, whereas the other side is precisely doing this. So yes, I would agree with what you say, but the first step to take, and I think Macron is doing that to some extent, but others have to do it as well, to put this agenda on the table and say, well, we want more European integration. We want European strategic autonomy. We want European sovereignty and all these terms. You have to say what that means, but you have to put it on the table first. And I think this is missing at the moment. Maybe it's changing.
Alfred?
Yes, I will try to be as short as possible. The first thing to say is that it's difficult to disagree on anything you have said. I wanted to make maybe some clarifications on what you have said. You say, for example, that what happens in the Middle East affects the interests of Europe. Okay, fair enough. But the question is by how much compared to other regions and compared to the past and looking into the future. Now, my own hunch about this is that, first of all, the Middle East is much less important, but much less important for the EU than Eastern Europe, Russia, the United States, and even I would add to this Turkey, which is central for the EU. Also, in terms of comparing over time, I think that you would agree with me that the dependence on oil and gas overall is decreasing, and fracking is a new technique, and new earth, which are become fashionable, are elsewhere than in the Middle East. And if you put all these together, you would say that as looking at resources and needs to from the Middle East as in the past, I would say that over the medium long run, the Middle East is less important than other regions are becoming. And now you will say, but what about, you would be right, what about this fascination for Gulf countries? Huh? Now, this is really one of the results of the clash with Russia, which makes that the overdependence of the EU on Russia has become a problem. And very quickly, we saw Mrs. von der Leyen land here to grab some of our gas, but she's doing this all over the place because this is a current problem. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, everybody sees, like Trump, the first, that there is a lot of business, meanwhile, to do in the Gulf because they have accumulated vast sums, etc. But that doesn't mean that in the future, in 30 years on, it will be the case. So I would say, yes, the Middle East is still important for the EU for the reasons I have mentioned, but trend-wise, I personally would say that less so. And let me add one point, which is a geopolitical point, that is that clearly the obsession or the fashion of focusing on the Mediterranean with the EU-Med initiative, the Union for the Mediterranean. This is all bunk. I mean, this is out of fashion. Everybody understands that this was an illusion of Spain and France of convincing all the others that this is where our future is. The Arab Printemps Arabe, the Arab Spring was a total failure, etc., etc. So here there has been a tremendous shift of attention in Brussels regarding this part of the world. Now, the conflict, our conflict, of course, when I say before the ceremony, when I was saying all the time that, Israel was advancing its relation with the European Union in spite of some hostility because of realpolitik reasons, etc., etc. But I was warning to those in Europe criticizing what I was saying that, of course, the conflict still has a symbolic and mediatic value, but we shouldn't overcome it. Make it as overarching. And I will. Yeah. So my question is to you: is the Middle East really so important for Europe as to engage and use resources? Let me finish by challenging you on one point that nobody speaks about. If the Middle East was so important, the Middle East conflict here was so important for the European Union, why doesn't the European Union say that we are going to contribute to solve the big problem by, for example, taking in some migrants, some refugees, partially. I am not speaking about that this will be the solution, God forbid. But if it would be as important as was the Ukraine conflict, where the EU said, well, we take Ukrainian refugees, they are our brothers, etc., or even the Syria civil war. But I don't see that. I don't see that. There is much talk, but is it really important for the Europeans or only because we see it in the media all the time?
I partly agree and disagree because I would agree with you that Eastern Europe is the main security concern, and this is going to stay like this. That's the main. But on the Middle East, I think the importance is big, and maybe the concept of negative and positive peace helps here. I think there is a negative piece, the absence of conflict, because conflicts are a challenge to Europe in terms of polarization, terrorism, also migration, which is an issue, even if you count away issues like radicalization, the labor market, etc. So the conflicts in the Middle East, the wider Middle East, as I said, including Afghanistan, has been a tremendous security challenge. So instability is on that level in the Middle East a great concern. And this says that Europe has a big interest in negative peace, at least. That there's interstate peace in the Middle East. Maybe not all the conflicts are solved, but there's no overall war. So that is definitely, I think, a big European interest. And positive peace, okay, has maybe a humanitarian development dimension, cultural dimension, has an economic dimension. And I think, yes, there are arguments too. That's what I try to make this argument with regard to relations between different G20 powers. The India, Middle East, Europe corridor was proposed by a G20 summit in Delhi. Because if you're not Russia or China or the United States, you have to interconnect between different regions. And one should probably not overestimate the economic benefits of this corridor, but it only operates in a stability paradigm. Could be a stabilizing force and something from which you profit as. And so it's not just about the classical fossil energy. It's about larger connections. And maybe there's a hype about the Gulf states. Maybe, but I think they have put themselves on the map and are going to stay there. And this induces a more positive interest of deepening relations. And traditionally, the EU has deepened relations with former colonies, very unequal, or with neighbors. This was for a long time the foreign policy, the ring of friends, as Romano Prodi said. And now the EU is reaching out to regions further beyond. And I think the reason is that you need these connections on the G20 level. The powers right below, and I don't think Russia plays in that league of China and the United States. Militarily, nuclear, yes, but otherwise not. But still, under this level, the G20 states, they have to make these connections. And I think this is a strong interest. And this doesn't put the Middle East at the same level like Eastern Europe, but at a very important level that matches Africa, for example.
Yeah. I have a couple of remarks. First, I have some cosmetic remarks to your speech. When you talk about the Scandinavia angle, you shouldn't forget the Finland. Russia and they feel more.
Yeah.
One comment about the Denmark and Sweden, the issue there is most sensitive. Then you said that Europe is a growing global trade power. Okay. From the Israeli point of view, of course, it's one of the most important trade partners. But globally speaking, as far as I know, the weight of the global economy, of the European economy, global growth is only getting less during the years and not growing. I might know also this data, and so from that point of view, it is an important trade and economic power, but it's not a growing power. Longer term. But now to our issue. Also referring to what Alfred said, it is not the case that to look at the data also from that point of view that Europe is so indifferent about what's going on here. If you look at the constant support that Europe gives to the Palestinian Authority, for example, that amount to almost 20 billion euros out of taxpayers' money, European taxpayers' money, and this is continuing. We described that in a paper with my colleague here, also Aviv which in which we describe the need to generate a conditionality regarding the European donations to the Palestinian Authority. Just imagine, without those funds, the Palestinian Authority would fall apart. If the Palestinian Authority would fall apart, I don't need to describe what the catastrophe scenario would be. This arrangement is also best for Israel from all perspectives, but it has a price. So it means that Europe has a leverage on what is going on here, and it should use it also to promote or be more proactive into a possible solution the day after, because the day after sooner or later will come. And then the question is, what is the role that Europe should play? And here I come to another point, which I think is much more not, considered or enough. Let's say we are not paying enough attention to that, is the enormous Euroscepticism that we have in Israel. And this has been also the case before the 7th of October. Perception in Israel during the years is that Europe is one-sided. It takes only one side, and it's not a fair broker, and lost totally its credibility also in the political establishment. And I wouldn't say this is only in the right-wing parties or something like that. It goes deep also in the center-left parties. This is one thing, and the other thing is that what is Europe thinking about if we want to have a rule here in the region to restore some partially this credibility in order to have also leverage on the Israeli side, and this is much neglected. Just give you examples. I mean, during even the second intifada, first intifada, second, when Solana was coming to Israel, this was news. This was a headline in the papers, and what he was saying was even more expressed in all the media. Today, nobody cares what is said in Europe on foreign policy of Europe. I mean, inside Israel proper. And therefore, I think that Europe should do, must do, if it wants, and this is a question mark, also Alfred to play a role to reconstruct its partially its credibility in very public opinion. Of course, it's difficult because now, and you have described it also, that there is now Europe is different from what it was during the Oslo Accords and those times, much more divided, probably, and focusing on other issues. But if you think about the roadmap that Europe take, because at the end of the day, they are investing huge amount of money into this region, then they should think more systematically how to do that. Only a small other remark on the security issue. Perhaps you could refer what is the role of Britain in this context. I mean, Britain is the most important military power, I think, in Europe. It is not part of the EU, but it does play a role, and also the game that you described and the role of Europe regarding the security.
I have a request and surprise. We have a lengthening list of people who want to make a comment. The request is maybe we can collect a few of them, and you will sort of summarize the discussion at the end. So so that would give more time to other
course.
people.
Yeah.
And the surprise is that Maya Sion is going to join us. Maya, are you with us?
Ah,
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
I'm here.
hi, Maya.
Hi. So should I ask my question? Okay. You can hear me well, I assume.
Yeah.
Okay. So at first, Stephan, thank you for a really wide spectrum, look at from the global to the regional to two regions, actually, to the EU and the Middle East. This is something that I'm going to research next month when I'll be at the SWP in Berlin. So my research is dealing also with the crink, the friction between the crink, so China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and the West, but also the fracture of the West that you described so well. And I'm going to look at how does that influence the relations with Israel. Also, obviously, within the context of the Gaza war, of the how the media in Europe and how the public in Europe views Israel nowadays, which is really at the low of the lowest. And this polarization that you've been speaking about, that's also an article that I wrote. It's going to be published at Tel Aviv University in a few weeks. So everything combines together. I would really love to hear your thoughts about how does that actually influence Israel and the Palestinians. And I want to connect that as well to the issue of normative, what's important for the EU or for Europe from a normative perspective, and that you've mentioned, international order, international law, international humanitarian law, but also not to be looked at as having double standards between the sanctions, like the 17 packages of sanctions against Russia, and maybe just a few sanctions against violent settlers here in Israel, and maybe we'll see how the review goes along of the association agreement. I hope you are right, and Italy will stay its course. If Italy changes its course, then Israel will find itself in a new territorial of problems, serious problems with the EU. And the public opinion in Italy is extremely critical, much more critical than in any other country, I think, or many other countries, about what's going on in Gaza. So I'm not sure about Meloni, where it stands. And then that normative prospect and the interests of Europe, seeing Israel as a strategic partner in terms of security, in terms of intelligence, know-how, and etc. And then to put it in a bit more context, the review of Article 2 is also made possible because Trump has not visited Israel, and Europe looks at how Trump is not backing Israel. And I think that has allowed Europe to start by Israel's friends in the Netherlands and elsewhere, this review of Article 2. And so I come to a more concrete question. To what extent Israel is an asset, and to what extent Israel is a liability for Europe?
Thank you, Maya. Sir, can you present yourself?
Danny Bartal. You were emphasizing in your talk separating the security matter and then analyzing the regional divisions and interests. But I think that there is another division in Europe which is very important, and in fact, more important than many of the factors that you mentioned. And this is between the experts in each country, and especially in EU, between the people who are foreign ministers, who are concerned with moral considerations, international law, and people who are interested or responsible for technological development, security Ekalon, who is very much, and they have completely different focus. So the people, like people who are responsible care to some extent about the international law, moral consideration, but versus people who are responsible for the technological progress, security, intelligence, and they have deep interest having a good relation with Israel. And I talk with ambassadors and also in Brussels, and this division is very salient that people have this different consideration, and therefore we seek some kind of importance of Europe versus Israel, which is economic power, technological power, military power, and even now, we just read that the sale of the weapons is going up. People want Israeli weapons to destroy in Gaza.
Thank you, Danny. Gisela?
And I mean, Europeans, Germany, absolutely want to have Arrow, and they goes through. So how does this go together? I mean, is it then all a game by saying, well, we don't want weapons to Israel, and we don't talk about the import we give? Is this any discussion that this goes? And right now, it sounds very strange that it is disconnected. The same people say that's not.
So first, thank you for a very interesting talk. I want to ask about the publics, right? You mentioned towards the end about polarization in society. And I wonder about that, how salient these issues really are. It's kind of following up on Alfred too. Right, so I was in Berlin during the elections in February. And I was surprised that no one talks about foreign affairs. Certainly the Israel-Palestinian issue was not a, far as I could tell, was not a big issue on the election campaign. Even this surprised me even more that the Russia-Ukraine war. Nobody talked about it. Everybody talked about migration, and about it's mostly in domestic, in domestic sense, right? So do the publics right? So there are some in capital colleges, and the media talks about it. But when it comes to the elections, and people have to vote, how much they care about foreign affairs more generally, and how does that affect kind of the politics of Europe and the European Union? I think that's something I'd like to do more about.
Yeah. We won't have time. Ivy's on my list.
So I want to thank Israel back for a second, include it, but I don't want to put the spotlight on Israel. And we'll start with the question, then I'll explain what I mean. I want to ask you to what extent you think that what you described about all these militarization of security policy and gains in Europe really make Europe's foreign policy incredible. Here I want to pick up on something that you started with, and you certainly argued that. But it's not just about the region, but it's a broader perspective. You mentioned Russia as something that played out within. If I take Russia aside and I think about the medium long term and the balance of power shifting towards Asia, towards China, and I think about Chinese involvement in the Middle East, how Chinese involvement in the Middle East actually affects Europe's foreign policy, the way you described it. I actually see Europe as quite vulnerable and perhaps meaningless, less meaningful than perhaps described. So, Chinese growing investment in software infrastructure like hardware and other technology, energy infrastructure, investment in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on. All these countries, when the Chinese invest in them, Chinese don't come with a normative price. Right? They don't say, okay, normative out of Europe, and if you don't abide by Article number 2, we're going to withdraw it and so on. We still have a corridor, right, from almost from Europe to China, but we don't need this sort of normative argument. This thing goes different kind of trade and investment agreement, and I think Robbie is there right thing. When you look at trade, Europe is less important. China is becoming far more important, and this is a big challenge, right? Challenge that you also see in political elements. So China as an arbitrator or a negotiator, sort of between different countries in the Middle East, and I look at the mediation of China between Saudi Arabia and Iran 2 years ago in March, and so anyway, there are different kinds of things. I can go on and on. I don't want to. So how do all these things that you described about Europe really plays out?
Ila?
Very easy.
So I would like you to reflect a little more on the European position regarding Israel. You mentioned several times with member states taking on main issue, a major challenge in the Israeli relationship. However, even I mean, the all the
Ila?
So, I'd like to ask a bit of a provocative question. Do you think that with regards to Ukraine, did the European Common Security Policy fail? There is any. And I would like to also double click a bit on Carl's remarks, on Carl's question before, maybe in a direction that he didn't really want it to go, but I think that on the backdrop of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I think that countries like Germany and Poland took the action there because of some what I would think, and I would like to hear your opinion about it, some inherent difficulties within the European operation, within the European government form of governance, that unlike the US, for example, when a president is coming into the White House, he can sign 180 different decrees that change completely the policy from the previous administration. No one elected European leader in the European Union that can probably change a bit in 5 years. So is this structure that can actually lead such a common defense policy that could react developing conflict. And I would take that also to the region, because we are trying to make a triangle here, also trying to take some of the conclusions from Ukraine. Europe is not meant, the common defense policy is not meant to exercise power outside European borders. So how would it influence far away a conflict, such as, for example, as in Gaza, or for example, as the Houthis are operating, which is forcing a very critical trade routes around the world, also affect
Last but not least, Eyal.
Topic, the amount of questions that really speaks to how important it was. I'm curious, you referred to a European pillar of NATO as a concept rather than an autonomous European defense capability. This entails a NATO-centric approach, still, in spite of the erosion of the US commitment to the alliance. So I'm curious whether European pillar of NATO should be the right conceptual construct to use right now. And secondly, as we head into the NATO Hague summit later this month, what should be the European pillar's approach to a renegade US president, accommodating his concerns without foregoing autonomous decision-making?
You have 13 minutes to wrap it up. And I'm
not
so
bad.
you've taken meticulous notes.
Promise reading them. To look them up. But I try to respond to briefly, but I hope I can encompass them, and credit to all these great questions. Robbie, I think the absolute relevance of Europe is shrinking, but this is because the global economy is diversifying. I don't have the figures with me, but it increases in many other instances as well. And all these different, so we have more hubs globally speaking, and they have to relate to each other. And Europe, I think, is and remains a central one in this changing. Yes, it sinks the relevance in absolute terms, but there are more hubs. There's a diversification of centers, of economic centers, and I think Europe has its role to play in this constellation. So this would be the model, I think. With regard, I agree that messaging is very important. I don't know. There's a new EU Middle East envoy, the former French ambassador to Israel. I haven't met him and don't recall what he has said. I don't know if he can communicate with the Israeli public in a different way. Maybe that's something we can hear over dinner later. Yeah. Britain has been mentioned by Robbie and by others. I think, yes, it's very essential. In the Ukraine, it's the coalition of the willing. One has to see, I mean, the Brits and the French came up with the coalition of the willing because they wanted to put a brake on Trump appeasing Putin. How much they follow up is another question, and what that means, coalition of the willing, one has to see. But I think in every security operation that we will see in Ukraine, the European dimension will be very strong, because the maximum the US will do is to enable it strategically, like that, but any operation will be European. That, and Britain is central here. So I think that's important. The problem with all these initiatives in peacemaking is that the statements are very bold, but the action is very slow. I call this Mikado politics, Mikado game. So there are always big statements, but the actors are all extremely hesitant to really engage. And I think many could offer some. And sometimes this could be pressure. I think on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as on all conflicts in the world, there has to be pressure from the outside. You don't solve long-lasting ethno-national conflicts just through incentives, but there have to be incentives too. And you have to have, particularly when it comes to a powerful conflict party, and Israel is powerful, you have to make incentives too, because there are, some have said it here, interconnections, which render assets Israel has of great interest to Europe. And this is definitely one of the reasons why the EU will be hesitant to follow up. So, but big statements are made. but you have to offer something concrete. And that is something I would criticize the EU on as well. So what do you offer concretely in terms of, putting pressure on the conflict parties, but also of incentives? The same with the Arab states. It's fine to say that you have a reconstruction plan for Gaza, but everybody knows that security is very important in Gaza. And this has to work differently in order to be acceptable to Israel, in order to also offer a horizon for the Palestinians. So from my perspective, Arabs, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, they have to be present on the ground in some extent. But they don't say that in this reconstruction plan. And it's 80 pages or 90, very detailed, but it's silent on security. So that's, I think, a big problem. And this shows the actors move very, very slowly. They observe what the others are doing. I think this is, I see it a big problem. Yeah, I think this also relates to what Maya said. I'm interested to hear what you report from your stay at the SWP. But yeah, this was a point you brought up as well. Israel is also an asset to the European on technology, on economy, also politically. So this will play a big role in this process. Dani brought up the division between what Emanuel Adler would call communities of practice, the epistemic communities as well, of the foreign policy community and the technology and security on the other hand. I think there is some truth, but I would disagree. And this was the argument I made, that international law, and we can make an analysis maybe of that, is not just a normative interest. Gisela brought up the normative interest, it's a strategic interest as well. Europe has a strategic interest in strong international law for various reasons, because it's a trade power and you need law to stabilize your status as a trade power. Europe doesn't have military bases all over the world. It will not have them as the United States. So you need, just for trade and all these issues, you need international law and a strategic approach to that as well. So it's normatively important if you say you want to just world order, and we know that in order to solve conflicts in the long term, there has to be justice. Without justice, conflicts don't get solved. So it's important from a legal dimension, but from a strategic dimension too. And I think this is understood in many capitals in Europe and in Brussels. So the gap between the security community and the others is not as big. I worked at the Bundeswehr University in Munich, which is the University of the German Armed Forces.
I'm surprised they didn't come in uniform.
Yeah. You can do that. Next time. I did social service. I didn't even go to the army. But now I have been adopted by the German armed forces. And the students, so it's compulsory for an officer in the German Armed Forces to have a university degree, and they study this at my university in social sciences. And one of the focus they have is international law. It's a central component as well. And these are people from the security field. And also, if you look into Brussels, the EU military structure, the military staff of the European Union, which is permanently based within the External Action Service, and the EU Military Committee, which are the chief of staff of the different European armed forces. They are part of the External Action Service, which is civilian as well, and they interact. So I think there's more interlinkage maybe than suggested, although I agree that, of course, it points this dynamic. So divergence, I hope I have responded to that. Yeah, of course, and very concrete assets. So the assets are not just hypothetical; they are concrete. Definitely. Johan brought up the elections in Germany. I totally agree. And as I said, this was the Merkel approach, and others did it as well. You don't talk about foreign politics. You talk about progress and stability. That's the election slogan. Or you say, you know me. That's how Merkel ran in a previous campaign. You say these kind of things. You don't talk about politics in election campaigns. hardly about domestic or economic. You don't. It's a problem. But so I can just agree with that. But foreign policy is very present in the internal debates that are happening. So I think decision makers are aware of it. The Zeitenwende, the changing, the time change. I don't know if translated into English. Has been very important. This was one speech, but then you just do it behind the closed doors and don't bring it to the electorate because you see how the electorate will respond. And as I said, I think this is a problem. You all mentioned China. I haven't given China enough attention in my talk, definitely not. So thanks for bringing this up, but there's also a problem with China. So I brought up the economic corridor just as an example, which was conceived of by India, by Europe and others as a counterweight to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, offering an alternative that has to be developed. But also the Belt and Road Initiative isn't working as smooth as Xi Jinping thought it would. And I think there's also a problem with this Chinese outreach. So in Novi Sad in Serbia, there are huge demonstrations against the government, which re-emerged after the train station in Novi Sad collapsed. And 13, 14 or 15 people died. So this was built with Chinese capital and laborers and material, and it turns out corruption, the material wasn't as good. So China couldn't really develop, and this kind of criticism doesn't just exist in Serbia and other places as well. That what China is doing there is not really profiting the local or national economies. That's a criticism brought up to the EU as well in trade agreements, that the EU is, but it's definitely a problem into which China runs as well. So I think it's not settled. And as I said, in response to Robbie, more diversity. Yes, China will become more important and is there to stay, but that doesn't mean that others don't find it. And maybe Europe with its standards, it can offer with probably less domestic security considerations dictated by party politics as in China, has something to offer as well in these kind of investments. So 2 minutes. And China, you also see in Southeast Asia that alliances are forming against, well, not against China, but to be more resilient vis-a-vis, responding to China. India, the ASEAN states, Australia, Japan, South Korea, sorry, they're all involved in that. European fragmentation is strong. Am I too optimistic? I just try to show you how the situation is. And I don't think a black and white is helpful here. There are political opportunities, and you see that actors ponder about them. The problem is really following up on them. I think this is a problem with many of the political initiatives. How do you make them rainproof or fireproof or whatever? So, but I think at least in theory, they're there as with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You have a drawer and you open it, and there are thousands of very good ideas and proposals of how to do it. The problem is following up on it, reacting to backlashes, etc. So the same relates to the EU's role, I would say. Gilad, yeah, I think not the common foreign security policy of the EU failed in Europe. I think the appeasement vis-a-vis Russia failed. There was reason for it, so you're always more clever afterwards. Something happened. There was reason to see what can we do with Putin, the Minsk agreement. But I think it's more the national security and energy strategies that fail in Europe, rather than a European one policy, which basically got only stronger as a reaction to Russia's 2014 and 2033. And final one, 30 seconds, understand, the EU pillar of NATO was mentioned. Yes? Yeah, I mentioned that. Yeah, the EU pillar of NATO is very important, and there I would see the main asset, also because, as I said, UK and Turkey are included there, Finland as well, very long land border and a small but very strong army and very strong reserve. So that plays an important role here. And whatever happens in Europe and the speed with which it develops and that it doesn't remain fragmented, in my view, depends on how coherently this will be defined in the NATO context. You appease Trump maybe by picking up the financial issue. If you say we raise the defense budget to 5%, and Mark Rutte, the NATO's General Secretary, is very creative in defining these 5%. Maybe it's 3.5%, and then you add the 1.5 missing percentages to other means. But this has to be made, and also operationally. And then the EU is the framework which can organize this European pillar of need. So co-organize with Britain. And so that's how I would see the sequence.
Thank you very much, Stephan.
That's great.
Yeah.
Please stay for assembly. You're welcome.
Yeah.